Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week is a, not necessarily recall, but a harsh critique of homeopathic eye drops, which is a bizarre product to be selling at the best of times. A case study of a teenager who lost their ability to speak or vocal cord paralysis due to COVID-19. A Wisconsin woman, MRIs, and why it is you don't take guns into these places. We also have a possible, albeit rather questionable, causality of type 2 diabetes that is being proposed. Archaeological finds regarding leather, and the interesting habit of Scythians to make it out of human skin. A novel way of generating uranium by filtering it from seawater. The ongoing debacle around New Zealand's health data that's been leaked and the court cases attached to it. The final news item shows that the Simpsons already predicted it with a plan to block out the sun in order to reduce global warming or climate change. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with something that has almost nothing to it. Homeopathy, both figuratively and literally in this case. The figurative element to this is, well, homeopathy really doesn't have any real substance that it's supposed to have in it, which is the irony in what's happened here. Homeopathic eye drop manufacturers have been told to stop making and selling their product. The reason for this is that it claims to have drugs as such in it, or more accurately, it claims to have an active ingredient. And the problem for these eye drop manufacturers is that if you have an active ingredient in a thing you are selling as a medicine like eye drops, you need it to be approved by the FDA. The FDA has approved 0 homeopathic eye drops. And in fact, even some of the eye drops they have approved recently have had their own raft of issues regarding treatment-resistant bacteria, contamination, unsanitary manufacturing, and so on. So the fact that the homeopathic eye drops have nothing in them might be seen as a benefit. But nonetheless, they're legally not allowed to sell them as is. Of course, the other big issue is simply that, well, they are just selling water in this case. There is nothing in the dilutions that homeopathic eye drop manufacturers are using, and certainly nothing that they could claim would be an active ingredient having any real effect on your eyes, especially given some of the bullshit claims they're making. For example, supporting circulation in your eyes, eye pain, blurry vision, and cataracts. These being treated with things like calcium fluoride, calcium phosphate, potassium hydrate, and a few plant pigments. None of these being shown in any kind of study to have any of the benefits that are claimed to be associated with their use. The FDA was surprisingly direct and kind of harsh in their advisory about this. It says, do not use ophthalmic products that are labeled as homeopathic, as these products should not be marketed. And yeah, as mentioned, although it's not going to do you any harm because there's no content, at least none intended, it's nonetheless not a great idea to use products that haven't been monitored and certainly aren't meant to be sold. It's why you don't go to back alley doctors. In a similar vein of nonsense medicine, although this time, let's say, ironic rather than without substance. It's a unexpected tweet we saw, and in short, the tweet says that the individual has a 12cm tumor in their lungs, and they think taking ivermectin is going to help. Like so many other scam and nonsensical panaceas, ivermectin will do nothing for a tumor. Whether it is a cancerous tumor or just a normal tumor, it will do nothing. The irony in all this is that, in fact, taking ivermectin could well have toxic effects on the individual, worsening their chances of entering remission if they're given appropriate treatment rather than nonsense, because of the effect it has on the body. This is kind of like trying to shoot yourself in the foot to solve another injury you have. All you do is create another complication. Shifting to another case study, or this time focusing entirely on COVID-19 and its complications rather than the idiots who are trying to prevent it with dumb ideas, we have a young teenage girl who lost her ability to speak due to vocal cord paralysis. By itself, that's kind of a horrifying byproduct of being infected with the COVID-19 virus, but it's the treatment required to actually get her body back to functioning that is arguably, at least for a teenage girl, much worse. They had to undergo a tracheostomy in order to open up their airways and allow them to breathe. This is hardly an experience any 15-year-old girl would particularly want to experience, but unfortunately it's not necessarily unheard of, but all the previous reports have been in adults. So in children, vocal cord paralysis, or what is effectively the inability to breathe, is quite stark and uncomfortable. The other, let's say, awkward and uncomfortable part of this is the process by which it developed. The young girl presented to hospital, was diagnosed, and then began treatment. She appeared to be recovering for 5 days, and then on the 9th day, she started having difficulty breathing. This is how they figured out that the vocal cords were causing the problem, as once they had a scope down there, they could see that it was closing when it should have been opening while breathing, and this is why she wasn't able to breathe properly. Her condition continued to become more complicated when she developed issues with swallowing, weakness on one side, tingling, numbness, and wasn't able to walk properly. And it's why all of this can largely be traced back to COVID-19 and the neuropathologies it appears to be causing, whether it is the far more benign, but arguably inconvenient, short-lived illnesses that are COVID infections, a long COVID with its variety of neurological effects, or in this very instance, a very niche but disconcerting case study. Fortunately, the young girl could celebrate her prom without any issue and without the tracheostomy in place, which, all things considered, probably not the right priority. But anyway, in other bizarre case study news, we have a baby growing outside of the uterus. And in this instance, no, not weird makeshift uteruses that are being developed in modern technology and science, but rather, still inside the mother, just not inside the uterus. The 37-year-old woman from the French island of Reunion was in hospital and, well, she was thought to be pregnant, but there was no pregnancy to be found in her uterus. There was, however, a 23-week-old baby in her abdominal cavity. This is not where you should normally find a baby, in case you're curious. Somehow, the fetus had managed to get out of the uterus and anchor itself to the membrane that lines the abdominal cavity, just down near the bottom of the spine. This is, for all intents and purposes, just another version of an ectopic pregnancy. Normally these are where you would find the baby in the fallopian tube, rather than in the abdominal cavity, but nonetheless, that's fundamentally what's happened here. Good news is that they were able to send the mother off to a more well-resourced hospital, and at 29 weeks, the baby was delivered early, but via surgery, and put into neonatal intensive care. They were then given the all-clear to go home 2 months later. The bizarreness of this is partly the fact that delivery would have been an absolute nightmare, but more importantly, it's not as rare as you might think. To be clear about this, it's not that this particular instance is common, rather that ectopic pregnancies occur more frequently than you might imagine. Some estimates places it up to 10%. Most put it significantly lower, but nonetheless. Of those ectopic pregnancies that aren't in the fallopian tube, these make up about 1%, and of those 1%, the vast majority go somewhere relatively similar. That is the peritoneal membrane, or the membrane that lines the abdominal region. Others find their way to the spleen, and others into different organs again. The initial issue with these pregnancies is not the actual pregnancy itself, as, well, the baby can survive, kind of. It's that the baby's unsupported in these areas, and so you have what is effectively an embryo, with its own placenta growing happily where it shouldn't be without support. And this tends to end badly, and why most of these become a miscarriage if they're not detected early enough. The secondary effect of this can also mean that you get maternal hemorrhage, that is the mother bleeding out and dying from shock or the hemorrhage itself. As mentioned at the start, fortunately in this instance, in the case study, the delivery was just fine and both mother and child came out healthy. The same thing can't necessarily be said of a Wisconsin woman. She went into hospital to get an MRI, and despite the variety of signs and other instruction, she took a handgun into the MRI with her, which then proceeded to be fired off and shoot her in the buttocks. Yeah. Yes, you have your right to bear arms, that's all well and good, but bear arms responsibly. Don't go into the giant magnetic donut, carrying something made of metal that can injure you or others. Fortunately in this case, there was a single shot fired off, and the 57-year-old woman got herself shot in the buttocks rather than injuring any of the medical staff and, worst yet possibly, destroying the incredibly important and expensive medical machine. What makes this worth noting, and less a case study and more a example of why you can't rely on certain sources for information, is that this was listed as an adverse event report for an MRI. Understand, adverse event reports are what they're using, particularly amongst antivaxxers, to justify why vaccines are bad. Admittedly, the vaccine system lists things like getting drunk or having affairs as a byproduct of vaccines, rather than getting shot in the butt. Nonetheless, MRIs now need to add that to their relatively long list of otherwise innocuous and certainly not really warranted concerns. In less exciting medical news, we do have a weird report talking about the possibility of a relationship between your mouth and Alzheimer's disease. This is not just that you forget what you've just said, but that it may well be possible that your mouth directly leads to Alzheimer's disease, although the Louisville researchers are arguably going a little bit far with how well established the link is. The other noteworthy, let's say, criticism of this is that it was research conducted in conjunction with a pharma startup, which does mean that they do have a significant bias, even if the bias is purely in terms of perception rather than actual bias. They believe that there's a relationship between gingivitis and Alzheimer's disease development. That's the gist of what they're saying. And they believe it's because the bacteria, that is Gingivitis, creates toxic enzymes that, when they're secreted by the bacteria, are related to markers of Alzheimer's disease. You have the tau protein and the ubiquitin protein. This is one of those studies where they've found a relationship, but they've not really been able to explain how the two are related. This is especially important when they mention in their own report on this that they found antigens for the enzymes in question in the brains of individuals with Alzheimer's disease, but also in those who didn't have Alzheimer's disease. As such, they're proposing that, well, in short, they hadn't had enough time to develop the disease yet. But a arguably less charitable interpretation would simply be that they didn't have Alzheimer's disease and that you just found a red herring. The same thing can't be said of the next study that we have, and that owes to the mechanism by which diabetes, and particularly type 2 diabetes, has its effect and becomes established. The thought is that nitrous oxide might be playing a major role in this. The very simplified and short version of their results are that they've found a particular enzyme called SCAN, or SNO-acetyl-CoA assisted nitrolase. This enzyme has an important role in attaching the nitrous oxide to the receptor for insulin. Without this, the receptor can't transmit its message, and as such, it would be why, even if you have a exogenous or injected amount of insulin, it may not work as well. And it doesn't work as well because the nitrous oxide isn't able to do its job in making the receptor appropriately process the signal it's receiving. Although it is in animal models, knocking down or at least reducing the activity of the SCAN enzyme, they were able to improve rodent activity of insulin. In humans, they found that the activity of this same gene is associated with worse performance of insulin for those who are injecting it. Something that isn't apparently helpful for you, although the fact this required research to establish is kind of disappointing, commuting. Yeah, apparently commuting to and from work is not good for your health. Road rage is obviously the cause of this, but that's probably not what the researchers were trying to find out about. In fact, it wasn't what they were trying to find out about. Their premise is that if you have a long daily commute, other than being stressed, yelling, waving hysterically, and just generally having a terrible time driving, you also have less time to be physically active, you tend to be overweight, drink more, and have poorer sleep. The research itself is fairly large scale, with 23,000 people involved, but it also involves a caveat in the form of it was a survey, so yeah. There's a slight issue with survey response rates, and the kind of responses you do get to surveys. The findings are that if you were to travel more than an hour each day, you had a much higher rate of, issues. Whether this was simply depression or if it was other complications again, compared to someone who commuted less than 30 minutes. The average of the respondents was 47 minutes, so almost exactly in the middle between these two extremes. Shifting from reasonably cutting-edge research to, ancient findings, and findings from Scythia, or Scythia, depending on how you want to pronounce it. This is an area towards Greece and then slightly north again. The Scythians were a historically kind of violent and terrifying barbarian group, or at least so say reports that were relevant to the time. But then again, historical anecdotes and stories of other countries aren't necessarily reliable. At least a large and very popular book has involved a bunch of people wandering around the desert in a half-day state for 40 years, which seems rather unlikely. The Copenhagen University results tell us at least something that is factual. That is, the Scythians, apart from liking to make their leather out of fairly typical places like goats, cows, and sheep, had a penchant for making them out of humans. This arguably does somewhat support Herodotus' reports on the Scythians, but thankfully not as much as you might initially have thought, largely owing to the fact that the human leather they found wasn't making up the majority of anything. Rather, it was a smaller subset and generally found in more, let's say, important places where presumably it was some sort of pride of place or a prestige symbol. The next news we have is similarly related to animals, although thankfully not the bipedal and naked ape kind, but rather the quadrupedal kind, particularly horses, and why horses have long faces. This might be an odd question to ask. Why does a horse have a long face? And no, that's not a bad joke. It's a legitimate question. The reason why you would ask why an animal has a longer face, or in this case jaw, versus otherwise, owes to the nature of how a longer jaw or similar affects their ability to get a grip on things. As a general rule, The longer a jaw is, the weaker the grip of the animal is. So, for example, a wolf has a relatively short jaw compared to other predators. That's why a lion doesn't have a massive maw. By contrast, those that hunt very small game, like for example rats and rodents, tend to be much longer. It gives them a good chance to catch the prey that they don't need a lot of strength to hold on to. The researchers propose a relatively simple but straightforward explanation as to why some species, like the horse, are an exception to this, and it's coming down to a change in diet, a somewhat sudden and unexpected change in diet. As a result, they've had to adapt what they have to their new foodstuff that they primarily consume, while they've also not really had the time to adapt their whole body and make anatomical changes. Going from, largely evolution to developments in energy. Although it's not so much energy itself, it's how we're going to get the material to make energy happen, given that there is a push, let's say, towards greater use of nuclear sources. Radioactive materials are not so easy to source. That's simply a fact of life. If they were easily obtained, we'd probably all have cancer from radiation exposure. Instead, most of it is sourced from a very few limited places, and then it's processed again, that is, to make it radioactive enough to be used in a reactor. In order to be able to get this raw material that can be put into reactors, you do need to have a very expensive mine built. A mine, not only does it require staff, it has huge safety considerations and a lot of upfront investment, it's not going to work very well. The alternative approach, as proposed, is to basically create a filter in the ocean that will capture uranium, floating around, and put it aside to use in reactors. The Nuclear Energy Agency estimates that there are 4.5 billion tons of uranium in the ocean, but it's not just uranium as it is, it's the uranyl ions, that is, individual ions of uranium, which isn't necessarily all that helpful, as capturing one ion will give you very much, if any, energy. In order to be able to make use of it, you need to get all of it together in a reasonably large mass. This leads to the use of what is effectively a very finely woven cloth, some electrodes, and the passing of a current through it to grab onto the uranium. This will have lead to the inevitable and obvious question of, are they actually going to get more energy out of the uranium once it's all gathered together in this filter than they put into it to try and gather it? Further, given that it took the team 24 days to gather just over 12.5 milligrams of uranium, is it actually efficient enough to put into practice? Speaking of putting things into practice, universities, or more accurately colleges, aren't. It's not that they're not using what should be out there, in the form of the end of affirmative action due to legal precedent, or rather, it's that they're trying to find workarounds to this. Yeah, it's one of these weird and stupid decisions to try and basically make the system work the way it's deliberately been told not to work, to try and perpetuate what can really only be described as an ideological intent. The issue here is universities should be meritocratic. They haven't been for quite a while, but they should be. It's why the decision to try and redefine merit to include race is a ridiculous and dumb idea. It's not just that, it's not something you can attribute merit to, but that it defeats the whole point of what's happened and will just wind up costing these universities a lot of money before long, defending their decision that they've already been told is wrong. Merit should be something you are recognized for, either it's work or achievements or something similar. Race is something you are born as. Once universities start defining it this way, they open a huge door to all kinds of issues around race not being something that somebody is intrinsically part of. As such, they're going to end up being in a situation where they may wind up with some very bad actors taking advantage of their very dumb decisions. This is why basing a mission solely on what is arguably at this stage going to be a racial criteria rather than merit and other factors that are balanced in order to give those who have the greatest merit access and give opportunities to those who, due to uncontrollable circumstances, might otherwise benefit from admission. They're just going to admit everybody and let people fail out, which is a terrible idea. Speaking of terrible ideas, we have a New Zealand court case that is, at this stage, fairly clear-cut, except for the individual trying to defend themselves. The court case regards an IT worker who's accused of leaking the healthcare data for New Zealand regarding things like COVID-19. It's had individuals like Steve Kirsch completely ballsing up their analysis of it in a spreadsheet and then claiming various results that are bullshit. For the rest of us, looking at the same data, we'd understand that you need to apply certain steps before you can interpret anything out of it. Understand, this is not publicly available data. This is private individuals' healthcare data the government has a record of for the purposes of appropriately distributing and allocating funds and resources for healthcare. It's not something there for an IT worker to give out to anybody and everybody who asks, or in this case they think could benefit. The individual thinks they're doing the right thing, obviously, because they've pled not guilty to the matter so far. There are times and places to be a whistleblower. This is sure as hell not one of them, when the individuals who they've shared the data with aren't exactly the best of actors. Speaking of IT and technology-related news, we have a neuromorphic supercomputer. This is also coming out of the Southern Hemisphere, although slightly further across the ocean in Australia rather than New Zealand. The International Centre for Neuromorphic Systems in Western Sydney have announced that they are building what they're calling the Deep South, which is something of a play on IBM's Deep Blue computer. This is arguably a massive and super powerful computer with 228 trillion synaptic operations per second. These would arguably and simply be the connections and interactions between the neurons in this system. The idea is that the whole thing is built with artificial neurons. The neurons are what will process the data, whereas the synapse is what's going to connect the data. Sadly, this is not going to give us something like the Terminator robot, simply because the design is inspired by or based on biological brains, but it's not biological in and of itself. That's a different project in Australia where they're trying to create an interface between living neurons and an actual processor. This one is simply a comparatively conventional computer with the processing units set up in such a way that they emulate a biological brain of sorts. Certainly not a New Zealand brain based on that previous news item, but a normal brain. The reasons a neuromorphic computer is arguably better is that it requires very little power. Admittedly, it can be as little as 20 watts of power, which compared to a regular CPU, and particularly one designed for this sort of application, is, well, very little. If you want to get into crypto mining, that is perfect. The other advantage to it is that theoretically it's anywhere between 4 and 16 times more effective for what you get out of it. The next piece of news we have for you shows that NASA must clearly be made up entirely of only old people or singles. Their most recent achievement has been to beam a 15-second cat video across the universe. Yeah. Other than taking a hotshot at NASA for something ridiculous, it was done for a largely good reason. Other than the fact that the cat is somewhat adorable, and they were sharing that video, the project was designed to test the ability to send a fairly large amount of data across a huge distance, 31 million kilometers or roughly 19 million freedom units. They sent the reasonably high-quality 15-second video via lasers from that far out in the universe back to Earth. Getting the data from so far away took 101 seconds. in order to be able to get the high definition video that far away, that quickly, they were transmitting at a rate of 267 megabits per second. Most home internet connections aren't going to be anywhere near that. If you are so fortunate as to have a faster connection, well, good for you. In further news that could be arguably seen as also astrological, although this time it's also a case of the Simpsons did it first, there is a plan to block out the sun, or at least dim it, in order to slow down global warming or climate change, however you wish to phrase it. Yeah, this is a kind of weird plan, idea, thing. What makes this, let's call it a proposal, rather disquieting is that it's partly inspired by major environmental disasters involving volcanoes and ash clouds. Yeah, not exactly what we want to be trying to emulate, unless you're a Bond villain or similar. But the inspiration does, because of that, make sense. They put forward that based on what we've observed with these ash clouds and other similar volcanic events, all we need to do is dim the sun by 1%, and the effect this would have on the Earth is to cool it by 1 degree Celsius. By the same logic, we might as well follow Futurama's lessons by going out and mining giant ice cubes and dropping those in the ocean for the same result. In another throwback to Futurama this week, we also have a idea put forward by physicists that there may be a way to create a paradox time travel. In theory, where in Futurama, the Fry manages to give rise to his own lineage, it may not be necessarily the case that this is, well, weirdly impossible. Although perhaps the worst case scenario that you may be your own grandfather, it's an example of a paradox where you can't exist unless you already exist, and you can only exist if you already exist. Which is a problem that goes around and around in a circle. Try asking this to a robot and the robot would probably explode. This is where an Australian researcher has been able to take Einstein's theory of relativity and show that, theoretically, if everything is as it should be in the model, that space-time will adapt itself and effectively prevent a paradox if it were to occur. The researchers basically put forward a model that shows that, yeah, you could travel back in time and you could have whatever effect you're trying to have, but all you'd really do is shift the causality of where you wound up to at the time that you time traveled to another point. Whether that is, for example, you close the door so the model has a window being opened instead. Rather than a butterfly beating its wings, you instead have a bird flapping theirs, and so on. The final news item we have for you this week is about China's strange satellites that have been deployed from its reusable spacecraft. China has been testing its ability to deploy a rocket with a small craft that could be redeployed, exactly the same as America was using up until relatively recently. This third test had it also send out about 6 small objects that are basically satellites. We don't know exactly what the satellites are for. They could be lasers, or they could be the more likely explanation of them being a sort of tracking and monitoring satellite, sending data both to the reusable rocket shuttle itself, but also back to Earth so that they know what is happening when, where, and why. Particularly useful if you're trying to improve its functionality. Sadly for History Channel buffs, this is not a case of the aliens are responsible. This is just that China's doing weird shit and we don't know what they're up to. In terms of the tiny wingman spacecraft, we do know what the major craft is intended for. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.